Hi, welcome to this free video training, looking after someone with an addiction. So in this video, I'm going to give you some helpful tools and strategies that you can use and implement if you're looking after someone with an addiction that'll help best serve you and enable you to best serve them as well. So that, you don't feel so lost and stuck and helpless and powerless, and also that helps the person with the addiction. So let's face it, when someone has an addiction, it turns everyone's world upside down, everyone's life upside down. So we're going to look at how best not to do that. If you feel like grabbing a pen and paper and taking relevant notes when handy, I suggest you do that, or when relevant. So before we get into it, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dean Powell, and I specialize in addictions and subconscious reprogramming. Not just drugs and alcohol, which seems to be the first thing we think about, when we think about addiction, but all things addictive: cigarettes, pharmaceuticals, porn, sex, relationships, work, exercise, spirituality, telephones, Tinder. Everyone has an addiction to something. So we look at what's underneath that addiction. So we don't worry about what's on top or whatever it is that they're doing. We look at the core that people are trying to fill and find out what that core void is. So also what happens as a result of these addictions. So unhealthy relationships, feeling isolated, feeling stuck, feeling lonely, feeling shame, feeling guilt, low self-worth, and then disconnecting with ourselves and inevitably everybody else in our lives. And the reason that I do this is many years ago I was addicted to methamphetamines and then alcohol and many other things before I finally turned my life around and got my shit together. And then after working in rehab centers for a number of years, I realized that I want to work more holistically with people. Like, I want to help them to sort out whatever that void is inside and not just stop using. And that's what I do now. So if you want any information, guys, if you have any questions after this video, please, you can either reach out to me on my website, so www.lifetorque, lifetorque.com.au, so lifetorque.com.au, or send me an email at lifetorque@gmail.com and I'll respond as soon as possible. Sorry, lifetorque@gmail.com. We'll get there. Okay, so content, let's get into it. How best to look after someone with an addiction. So the first and probably most important thing to realize, and you might have already realized that unconsciously or subconsciously, what we tend to do when we're looking after somebody with an addiction tends to push them further into the addiction. Obviously not purposely, because what we do out of genuine care and genuine love and genuinely wanting them to stop. But I don't know if you've noticed, it tends to push this person further into it. There's a couple of reasons for this. Number one is somebody struggling with an addiction. They're already feeling pretty helpless and powerless, and maybe not even consciously, but definitely, subconsciously or deep down without acknowledging it. They feel helpless, they feel powerless in one or more areas of their life, and it often stems from some childhood trauma that they've experienced. So having somebody else take the reins, so to speak, or, take charge and, can actually help leave them feeling even more helpless and more powerless, and then wanting to use even more. And that can kind of become their only sense of control, I guess. So, they use whatever the addiction is, they'll use that as a sense of control or as a sense of masking, a sense of feeling better for themselves. So they feel even more helpless and powerless. And number two is sometimes we can unconsciously enable these people. So providing a safe space for them to continue using. And often we can do that because in some way we might feel responsible for this person using, There might be an underlying fear for us that we've actually caused this problem or had something to do with it at least. And we do this in a number of ways, we enable people. One is helping them out with money. So it's always nice to help those that we love because we genuinely love them and we genuinely care for them, and the natural instinct is to save them from any pain they might be going through. But it's from the pain in life that we often learn. So it's usually the consequence of the pain that we get the learning. And if we take away the consequence from people, then they don't get that learning. We actually rob them of that learning. So an example of that was, I remember when my son was about 15, he came home from school, it was actually at night, late at night, and he'd been watching TV, and he came up and asked me to write him a note to say he was sick because he couldn't do his homework. And I said, how come you haven't done your homework? He said, oh, I don't know, I just didn't want to. And there's a part of me that really wanted to write that note for him because I'm his dad, and I didn't want him to get in trouble or get detention. And I just said to him, buddy, if I write that note, what kind of father would I be? How's that me teaching you to take responsibility for your actions? I'm just taking away your consequence for the action. And as much as I wanted to write that note, I just didn't write that note because I knew that would just set up a pattern where he could just come and ask for me to rescue him when he wasn't responsible for himself. So leaving the person with their own responsibility and then the pain of their actions and then the consequence of those actions is where they get their learning from. Also providing free room and board. So it can make them easier to continue using if they don't have to provide for themselves or look after themselves. So sometimes when we make it so easy for them, and especially parents, it's an easy one to fall into because we really want to look after our kids, we want them to be safe and we want to know where they are. And so what we do is, by providing them the free room and board, and then they still manage to go and get money to use or, whatever they're doing, can make it too easy for them to continue using. I remember when I was working in the rehab centre in Western Australia, and I was facilitating the parents program, and there was a man who came in, I think he was in his maybe late 50s, early 60s, and he shared and he cried as he shared about having to call the police on his son because his son was living with him and he was injecting and he was using more and more, and then the father said he was at his wit's end and he just didn't know what to do anymore, so he called the cops on his son and had his son arrested. And he cried as he said, his son was calling him all the names under the sun as the police dragged him off. You're a dirty dog, what sort of father are you? How could you do this to your own family and your own son? I'll never talk to you again. And then his son was locked up and put in jail. I think about 6 months later, I was also facilitating the men's group in this addiction centre, and a young guy came through and he started to share and he started to cry as he shared, and then I remembered it was actually the same guy's son because he shared about how his father had called the police on him. And as he cried, he said, look, my dad saved my life that night. He said, I never ever would have stopped using. I was getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And he said, I called my dad all the names under the sun. I called him a dirty dog and I said he was a shit father. And he said, but the truth is, that was the best thing my father could have ever done for me. It was tough love. He said, but my dad did whatever it took and he saved my life. So sometimes it takes, this tough love, this hard place to go to, but to set that boundary and to, not let them continue what they're doing for their sake as well. And then we have to experience some pain in that, and sometimes that pain is actually heartache. Okay, so another reason we enable them is we try to save them from the consequences, so we pay their fines for them, or, we lie to people, lie to the police, or, we kind of tiptoe around on eggshells and, we make sure, we kind of change their world so that they're okay, so look, don't upset your father, he's had a really bad day, like my mum used to do this all the time, guys, be quiet, come outside, go and play outside, go and do this because your dad's in not such a good mood, or he's had a rough day. So we found ourselves walking around on eggshells all the time. So then it wasn't okay just to be us, just to be kids, because one person is struggling with an addiction, and nobody wanted to upset him. So when we do that, that person with the addiction suddenly has all of this control and all this power that we hand them, and sometimes it's too much for them to handle, which is why they use in the first place, sometimes. So addiction is already a very selfish and self-centered thing, so having all of that power, they end up getting more and more power, which is, like I said, which might be not so good for them. So us walking around, tiptoeing around on eggshells around Dad all the time just so that he didn't fly off the handle and lose the plot. It didn't serve any of us, it stopped Dad getting angry, sure, but it didn't serve Dad, it didn't help Dad, he just ended up getting more and more control, more and more power there. Okay, so number 3, often when we're caring for someone with an addiction, it means sometimes it's the only connection that this person gets. So they feel so disconnected, so isolated, so alone in the world that the only relationship they seem to have is with whatever the addiction is, yeah? And for a partner or a parent or a friend, somebody looking after somebody with an addiction, that can feel like a betrayal. It can feel like this person's having an affair with whatever they're doing, and that seems to be more important than us, and that's the story that we tell. As much as that's not true for, for the person with the addiction, because in our mind, like I remember when I was a full-blown junkie, and in my mind I still didn't have an addiction. I was stealing, robbing off everybody I knew, and doing all sorts of horrible stuff to people and with people. And in my mind I was never an addict. No, I can stop anytime, I'm fine, I'm not as bad. And there was a deeper part of me though that knew like this thing had such a strong hold on me. This thing, I needed this thing so much that I couldn't do without it, because it's the thing that made me feel better. It's the thing that helped me to escape all of those horrible feelings that I was feeling, like low self-worth, shame and guilt and no self-confidence and all of that stuff. So rather than experience any of that, I kept using, and then when I used, this thing gave me confidence. It gave me high self-worth in a sense. It gave me this feeling of, hey, look, I'm okay. It numbed me out. So then every time I needed some confidence in my life, I needed to turn to this drug or the alcohol, and that started to get bigger and stronger, and I started to get smaller. So the bigger that got, the smaller and weaker I became. So then every time I needed any confidence, I'd turn to that at all. And it got to the point where, like I couldn't even walk outside the house. I couldn't face people unless I had this in my system. So the power and the control of this thing, this entity of this, addiction, grew so much more than I thought I had, like any of that stuff. So I just became weaker and smaller until I was just completely dependent on it. Obviously, it wasn't a conscious thing. It wasn't something that I wanted. Now, at that same time, I was in a relationship and I had, kids, and as much as they were my world and they meant everything to me, this thing seemed to be bigger than that even. And not consciously, that was the last thing I wanted, because I loved them unconditionally, So it takes a hold of us that we don't even become aware of, and we just become so fixated and selfishly, consumed with whatever this addiction is. So what happens often then is a person will try and collude their partner or their friends or their siblings into their behavior, into whatever it is that they're doing, in order to feel connected to them. But then sometimes the partner will actually do that because it's the only time you get a connection with this person. So if you're feeling totally isolated, if you're feeling like this person's never around, all they're doing is focusing on their addiction or living their addiction, and you don't get any time with them, then sometimes you'll join them in that, or somebody will join them in that, whether it's drinking or smoking, pot, or whether it's, whatever it is, any addiction, like eating shit food. It might be, it might be an unhealthy work, so they'll go and spend time at work with them. So they'll go and collude with them in that, just so that they get to have a relationship or some kind of connection with them. But this doesn't last, because it's an unhealthy form of connection there. So I remember doing this with my partner, my ex-partner actually, and excuse me, just take a drink. I remember doing this with my ex-partner when I'd stopped the drugs, and then I went to New Zealand and I just became an alcoholic. And then I tried to collude her into what I was doing. So I'd buy myself cartons of like Jim Beam and Coke because it was my favourite drink, and then I'd buy her cartons of these UDL cans, vodka and something, I can't remember what they were, but because I knew that she liked them. And then so what I did was I colluded her in my behaviour, which means that she kind of, started to come in, and it condoned what I was doing for a period of time. Yeah. And that didn't serve her, and it didn't serve me, and it didn't serve the kids, so we both became alcoholics for a while, which was not helpful, obviously. So I hope that makes sense, guys, some of the reasons why we actually enable people and how people get so stuck in addiction. So now let's have a look at some of the ways to change at least some of this. So number one, first and foremost, always get support, guys. So go and seek support, preferably from a professional, somebody who knows what they're doing, somebody who's hopefully been through it and knows the way out. Like if you're going to climb a mountain, get a guide who's climbed the mountain to show you the way up, yeah? So same with this. Most people, there's millions of centers out there, people who want to help. There's loads and loads of helplines. There's people online everywhere. The reason these people do this is because they have a genuine interest in addiction. I can guarantee you they're not just doing it for the money, or most of the time, yeah. because there's not a lot of money in it necessarily. It's because they have genuinely been affected by addiction, either themselves or somebody in their family, and they do this because they want to make a genuine, authentic change in the world. So go and see somebody. This is why I have a 16-week online addiction program. So for people who are struggling with addiction. And I created it actually originally because when I was working at the rehab centre in Australia, there was the people ringing from remote areas of Australia who couldn't come in and access our program, access help, you know. And there were also people who didn't want to be seen walking into an addiction centre. So I created this online program using the best of what I'd learned there, but also the stuff that I'd learned in my own life and as an addict and a more holistic kind of view, to help these people and you know, give them something that they can actually do in the privacy of their own home if they want to do that, so that they get to have some help as well. And then I created a 12-week online program for people who are looking after people with addiction, because like I said, what they tend to do out of love pushes a person further into it without them realizing. So this program is all about how to set healthy boundaries and how to, you know, like how to look after yourself, how to take the attention off that person and back onto you, how to make those changes and those shifts in energy. So if you want any more information about that, just visit my website or flick me an email and I'll let you know about that. So number 2 is allow the person to experience some pain. So stop trying to save them. The easier you make it for this person, the easier you make it for them to continue doing whatever they were doing, yeah? Now, I don't mean to create unnecessary drama. I don't mean to, you know, just pick fights and you know, create commotion or, you know, confrontation. But I mean becoming absolutely ruthless and determining what's your stuff and what's their stuff, and then leaving them with their stuff and then looking at whatever it is that's coming up for you, so working on your own stuff. And inevitably, when you leave them with their stuff, they have to deal with it, yeah? So most of the time we try to save them and rescue them, and especially parents, you know. Parents, we tend to either parent from our own pain, or we try to give our kids, you know, everything that we never got. So we try to save them from what we went through, or we try to give them what we never had. And either way, it doesn't serve them, you know, like they end up having their own struggles as a result of that. So when we deal with our own stuff, deal with our own pain, we don't parent through our own pain, we just parent consciously. So, number 3, don't in any way, shape or form collude in their behaviour, ever. If you want them to stop drinking, then don't ever drink with them. If you want them to stop eating shitty food, don't ever eat shitty food with them. Eat healthy around them. So if they're drinking, drink water or drink juice or drink smoothies or drink something that's healthy. What this does is, I mean, it kind of might, obviously it does, you still end up having that disconnection and you feel even more isolated, but then when you focus on yourself and you bring this attention to you and you don't do that, then what they're doing is you're not giving them permission to keep doing what they're doing. You're saying, hey, that's not okay for me, and I'm going to do this, but you know, like in a sense, I'll leave you with whatever you're doing, but I'm going to focus on me and make sure that I'm not doing that. So as much as sometimes people resent that, you know, when we first change, especially if we first stop, you know, drinking or using whatever we're doing, then other people around them are going, oh, what are you doing? Come on, don't be a pussy, get it and just have one, it doesn't matter, you know, it's not going to kill you. And they do this because what it does is it confronts their own issues, it confronts their own pain and their own, oh shit, maybe I've got a problem here. And rather than confront that, it's easier just to get people to collude in their behaviour. But the people who collude in their behaviour gives them full permission just to keep and continue doing what they're doing. So when you don't collude in that, what happens is suddenly that person has to stop and they get to look at themselves, because they start to feel even more isolated and alone, and maybe I have got a problem, maybe it's just me that's going on here. So don't ever collude in their behaviour. Don't ever make it easier for them to continue doing what they were doing. Often we can do that just by avoiding what's actually going on in our own life as well. So rather than just checking out what's coming up for me and what's going on in my life, so sometimes it's easier to focus on this person with the addiction so that I don't have to worry about these other things that are happening in my life, this other pain that I might be experiencing. Oh my God, I have to focus on my son, he's so stuck and he's so much of a struggle. And so we become consumed with that person, instead of actually realising we've got a whole lot of stuff going on, and that's an escape. That's a form of manipulation and control as well. So, number 4, encourage them to get professional help. So again, there's 1,000,001 people and places out there who are, who are always willing to help, who have been through this, who know what you're going through, who have experienced it, like in different forms and levels in their own life, and they, like I said, they do it because they genuinely give a shit. They genuinely want to help you to shift out of that because they know that pain and that struggle of addiction. So encourage them to get help, but make sure it's from a professional, and then let them help. Number 5, get help yourself. So when we change, so when we change something in us, then we unconsciously give everyone else something completely different to respond to. Yeah, so that energy is completely different. So whenever we change, they have something different to respond to. So when you take the focus off the person and you bring it onto yourself, at least one of two things happens. One is you start to feel so much better and live so much better, and you start to actually be able to manage yourself better. And number 2, automatically all of that energy that was on them suddenly gets taken off them, and they can feel that as a sense of pressure, all that energy, and like everything's about them. So there's all this energy and pressure on them. And when you take that off them, suddenly they have some room and some space to be able to breathe and to be able to, start to look at themselves and their own life. And I saw this many, many times when I was working in the parents program and, in the partners program. So like these people, when they started to implement some of the tools and strategies that we gave them and taught them how to set boundaries and how to not rescue and not caretake and all of this stuff, then they suddenly started to feel better within themselves, and even something, their relationship started to improve with them and also the rest of the family as well. And then they noticed the change in the person who had the addiction as well, because they started to feel that difference, and then they started to kind of inspire them in a sense to get themselves together. Not always, but mostly. So, number 6, it doesn't make you a bad person to leave somebody with their consequences. That doesn't make you a bad person. Like I said, the way we learn is through our consequences of our actions. If we keep taking away people's consequences for their actions, then they'll never learn. Or they will learn that you'll keep saving them and rescuing them, and then they just get into deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper poo. Yeah. So it doesn't make you a bad person to leave somebody with that. It means that you know how to have responsibility for yourself, and you know how to leave responsibility with somebody else. It means that you know how to set good boundaries. It means that you know how to best serve them and best serve you. And the way you can best serve them is by best serving yourself, believe it or not. They teach you not to be selfish. Man, it's important. I implore you to be selfish. Solely concerned with yourself, first and foremost. Like they say when you're in a plane, if the gas masks drop down, you put it on yourself first, because if you're trying to put it on everyone else or your kids first and you pass out, then you're no good to anybody. It's the same in life, yeah? So number 7 is set boundaries. So really, really important, guys, to set boundaries. So no boundaries can result in everyone, including the person with the addiction, feeling totally unsafe because they don't know where everybody starts or finishes. There's no boundaries. And what we tend to do in our life is we tend to set boundaries around everyone and everything in our lives so that we feel better. So I'll set a boundary around you, and I'll set a boundary and don't you talk to him, or don't be like that, and make sure you're different around. So we have all of these boundaries that we're trying to control and manipulate, which becomes tediously, unbearable and not even able to, we can't even sustain that. It's unsustainable. So rather than that, set boundaries around yourself. Yeah, it's much easier to set a boundary around yourself. And so when it comes back to self-focus, setting boundaries. This is okay for me, this is not okay for me. This is where I start and this is where I stop. It lets people know where you start and stop. It lets people know that, hey, that's not okay for me. This changes something in somebody else, because then they know where you are. And people, when you first do this especially, people will push those boundaries. They'll try and push those boundaries and challenge those boundaries and get you to waive those boundaries. And if you move those boundaries and waive those boundaries, it doesn't mean you have to become completely inflexible, but if you move those boundaries and there's a set boundary, then and you fold that boundary, then they'll know they can just keep walking over your boundaries all the time. I meet many people like this and work with many people like this, where they just let the guard down. They'll set a boundary and let the boundary down. So the thing is, you have to set a boundary, and then there has to be a consequence to that boundary if they try and break that boundary. So there has to be a consequence to their action. And if there's no consequence to their action, they're not going to learn. So if you cross this boundary, so if I'm saying, look, alcohol, no more alcohol in my life, yeah? Because if you're going to continue drinking, then it's affecting the whole family. That's not okay for me. I don't want to be in a relationship with an alcoholic. So if you're going to set that boundary and this person continues to use, then there has to be a consequence to that boundary. So I'll tell you what, if you continue to use, then I'm going to leave. Now there's a hell of a boundary. I'm not telling you it has to be that way. I'm not telling you to leave if you're in a relationship just because somebody's got an alcohol problem, but it might get to a point where you might have to. So when you don't, and you just keep putting up with that behavior, sometimes for years and years and years, like my ex-partner did, then in a way it's colluding in their behavior. It's giving them no consequence for their action. And I worked with many, many guys in the men's circle who had to lose their partners and lose their kids in order for them to realize, shit, I've got a problem. Now, sometimes they'd come in and they'd be like, oh, my partner left me, she's such a bitch, and how dare, she's so cold, and she just took off. And I would say, hang on. Your partner has probably been grieving for the last 3 to 4 years, or maybe 2 years, or however long she's been trying to get you to change. She's already done her grieving. She's been trying to get you to stop and trying to get you to wake up, and you just haven't listened. So now that she's actually made that choice and left and given you that pain, you're suddenly awake and you have to do something about it. So sometimes the earlier we do that, the better it is, because the person doesn't slide into it so much and fall into the addiction so strongly. So I'm not saying this is in any way our responsibility or our fault, but it's about, how do I manage myself? How do I set really good boundaries for myself? Very, very important. So guys, I hope you found this helpful. And if you have any questions at all, please reach out, send me an email, or just contact jump on my website, and there's a contact form on there. There's also loads of other information. I've got loads of videos on my YouTube channel, which is linked to my website as well. And I'll leave a link at the bottom of this page for the Addiction Carers program, the 12-week online program to help people looking after people with addiction as well, if you want some more in-depth knowledge and you want to learn how to implement this stuff in a much deeper way. So hope you have an amazing day, guys. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. I love sharing this stuff and talking about this stuff, and it's so cool for me, having seen it from the eyes of an addict. So I know the manipulation, little tricks and control strategies that we use, and the ways we are, how good we are at manipulating people. So I know how to kind of hack that, if you want, in a sense. So yeah, I hope this has been helpful. Take care. Bye.